In the pitch-dark night, while flying over the Atlantic Ocean, an Airbus A330 carrying 306 people suddenly runs out of fuel. The lights go out, and instead of the engine noise, there is an eerie silence in the plane. The plane starts descending rapidly towards the water, and people begin to scream and shout in fear. The pilot makes several attempts, but the plane remains out of control. This is a situation that no one would want to be in, and perhaps even the plane should not have been in this situation. But a small mistake and a little carelessness can lead you into a big problem. We learn a lesson from this incident. This is the story of Air Transat Flight 236. So why did this incident happen? Whose mistake was it? And how many people lost their lives in it? Let us now explain all of this to you in detail. On the evening of August 23, 2001, Canadian airline, Air Transat Flight 236, with 293 passengers and 13 crew members, was preparing to travel from Toronto's Pearson International Airport to the city of Lisbon in Portugal. They were supposed to complete this journey in about 7 hours with an Airbus A330 plane. All the passengers on the plane were very happy because it was vacation time, and they had no idea that a major incident was about to happen in a few hours. The aircraft used in this flight, the Airbus A330, was one of the most advanced and highly automated planes at the time. It had been introduced 7 years before, and at that time, it was considered one of the safest aircraft in the world. Even the plane that was used in this flight was only 2 years old. That means there was no need for anyone, from passengers to crew members, to be worried or anxious. The flight was under the command of 48-year-old Captain Robert Pish, who had 16,000 hours of flying experience and had flown various types of planes in his career. Although there was a stain in his career, as he had spent 16 months in jail on charges of drug trafficking before joining Air Transat. Apart from Robert Pish, the first officer of this flight was in the hands of 28-year-old Dirk de Jager, who had approximately 5,000 hours of flying experience. After all the formalities, Flight 236 was filled with 48 metric tons of fuel. As soon as all the passengers and crew members were on board, the process of pushing the plane to the runway began. Around 9 p.m., after completing all routine checks, the captain fires up the engines, and Flight 236 takes off to head to Lisbon. In just a few minutes, the pilot takes the plane to an altitude of 39,000 feet, and after that, the plane stabilizes. Now, since this plane was scheduled to arrive in Lisbon in the morning, most passengers were also relaxing and getting ready to sleep. In long flights like this, pilots don't have much to do, so their main tasks are to keep an eye on the fuel quantity and ensure that the plane's systems are functioning properly. The first 4 hours of the flight pass relatively smoothly. However, as the flight approaches the halfway point over the Atlantic Ocean, the pilot receives a strange warning on the computer screen. This warning is about engine number 2, which is on the right side of the plane. The warning indicates that the engine has high oil pressure, low oil quantity, and low oil temperature. This was a strange kind of warning that neither of the two pilots had experienced before. Typically, when a flight takes off, the oil temperature increases rather than decreases. Both pilots immediately refer to the flight crew operating manual to understand this warning combination, but they find no information in it. Afterward, they promptly contacted Air Transat's Maintenance Control Center in Mirabel, Canada, to inform them about the problem. However, they received no assistance from there either. The official they speak to tells them that as soon as he understands the problem, he will contact them again. While waiting for a response, the pilots once again make efforts to understand these warnings. In the plane's cockpit, the pilots were experiencing a great deal of stress, while the passengers in the back were fast asleep, unaware of the impending danger. Similarly, nearly half an hour passes, and around 5 a.m., the pilots receive a new message on the screen. This message states that there is a fuel imbalance inside the fuel tanks in both wings of the plane. This means that there is more fuel in one wing and less in the other. Fuel imbalance in a plane is quite rare, but not very dangerous because to fix it, the pilots open the cross-feed valve, which allows the excess fuel from one wing to flow into the tank of the other wing, equalizing the fuel quantity in both wings. However, just 10 minutes after doing this, the pilots receive another warning that there isn't enough fuel in the plane to reach Lisbon. Now things start to get a bit more serious. The plane was currently in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and had no way to reach Lisbon under any circumstances. In this situation, the pilot had no option but to make an emergency landing at the nearest airport. However, because the plane was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, their only option was to land at Lodges Airport on Terceira Island in the Azores. The pilots promptly contacted the local air traffic control at Lodges Airport and informed them that due to a fuel shortage, they needed to land at the airport.at this time. There were only 7 tons of fuel left in the plane, which was just 6% of its full capacity. The fuel was depleting rapidly, and the pilots couldn't understand the reason for this. They were certain that it couldn't be due to a fuel leakage, because there had been no turbulence felt in the plane, and the weather wasn't severe enough to cause a fuel leakage. Furthermore, during the first 4 hours of the flight, the fuel had burned in a normal manner. Not only that, but the captain had also checked with the flight attendants if there was any sign of fuel being jettisoned from the plane's rear. However, no such indication was found during the check. So, the pilots were left perplexed, trying to figure out what could be the sudden reason for the fuel running out. When the pilots couldn't find any continuous reason for the decreasing fuel, they considered it as a computer error. They thought that the sensors measuring the fuel capacity were not displaying correct data, leading to the fuel shortage warnings. However, the reality was quite different from their initial assumption. In reality, there was a significant fuel leak occurring from the right side engine of the plane. The cause of this was that inside this engine, a hydraulic pipe had chafed against the fuel pipe, resulting in damage to the outer casing of the fuel pipe. This led to a substantial fuel leak spilling out. The fuel imbalance in both wings was a clear indicator that the plane was experiencing a fuel leak. However, the pilot's attention did not turn in that direction. This occurred due to a psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias. According to this phenomenon, the human mind tends to favor only those things or information that confirm its existing beliefs. In this process, it often overlooks the correct information. This typically happens when the mind is fatigued or overloaded with work. In this case, the pilots had already assumed that the fuel shortage warning was due to a computer error, so they disregarded clear indications like fuel imbalance. Although the pilot had transferred fuel from one wing to another, the fuel imbalance issue remained the same. Furthermore, the fuel was depleting rapidly. The plane lacked a system that could directly indicate a fuel leak to the pilots. They had to deduce this themselves by interpreting various warnings. In this regard, both pilots of Flight 236 failed. At this point, the plane had only 4.8 tons of fuel left, while it should have had at least 17 tons. Both pilots contacted maintenance control again, but once more, they received no help. The idea of performing a fuel leak procedure crossed the pilots' minds, but Captain Pish refused. This procedure would require them to bring the plane down to 20,000 feet. Captain Pish thought that if there was indeed a fuel leak, descending to 20,000 feet would be akin to suicide. In this situation, they opted to stay at an altitude of 39,000 feet. Captain Pish's decision proved to be correct. At 6:13 a.m., the right side engine shut down, and Captain Pish began the descent by giving full power to the left engine. Because the plane could not fly at 39,000 feet with just one engine's assistance. During this time, First Officer Dirk de Jager informs the Air Traffic Control (ATC) about their situation. At this point, the plane had only 600 liters of fuel left, and the plane was still 240 kilometers away from its destination, which was Lodge's airport. For 13 more minutes, the plane continues to operate in this manner. However, after that, the left side engine also shuts down due to fuel exhaustion. Flight 236 was still 120 kilometers away from its destination. After both engines shut down, the plane lost its electrical power, leaving the pilots with no option but to glide. In this situation, a device called the ram air turbine deployed automatically in the lower part of the plane. It generated power by spinning, enabling some of the essential cockpit systems to function. Captain Pish had only one remaining option: to glide the plane as far as possible and attempt to reach the nearby Lodge's airport. So, the lives of all 306 people on the plane were now in the hands of Captain Pish. The cabin was dark due to the power outage, and in these conditions, the captain instructed the flight attendants to prepare all passengers for a crash landing in the water. However, crashing into the water was a terrible idea because, even if people survived the impact, the ocean water could become a deadly threat to their lives. Captain Pish had only one option: to try to glide the plane to Lodge's airport. However, this was a challenging task. The airport was approximately 100 kilometers away, and the descent rate was about 2,000 feet per minute. Since the plane was at an altitude of 30,000 feet, it meant that in the next 15 minutes, it would either touch down, whether the captain could reach the airport or not. Captain Pish faced an incredibly challenging situation. The Airbus A330 was not a glider, and 2 out of 3 hydraulic systems had failed, making it difficult to control the plane's pitch. Additionally, several key systems, including wing spoilers, nose wheel steering, and thrust reversers, had also failed. This meant that not only was it difficult to reach the airport, but even if they managed to land, stopping the plane on the runway would be extremely challenging. The situation was dire, and Captain Pish had to make some critical decisions. At Lodge's airport, the tower controller began flashing the runway lights on and off. This was done to help Captain Pish see the runway from a distance. It had a twofold benefit. It guided the crew toward Lodge's airport, and it signaled that they were on the right track. Gently gliding the plane presented a challenge for Captain Pish. He needed to maintain a speed of at least 140 knots to keep the ram air turbine generating electricity. However, he also had to be careful not to exceed a speed of 200 knots to prevent the landing gear from deploying prematurely. Captain Pish faced a new problem when the plane got very close to the airport. His job was to keep the plane as high as possible while gliding, but he had done it a bit too well. The plane was only 8 miles from the airport, but its altitude was 13,000 feet, which was much too high. Ideally, the plane should have been at 3,000 feet at this point. Captain Pish realized that if he tried to bring the plane down suddenly, it would lose its speed and might not make it to the runway. So, he performed a 360-degree turn to descend more gradually. During this time, First Officer Dirk de Jager lowered the landing gear and extended the slats on the front of the wings. This allowed the plane to fly at a slower speed without creating too much drag. Captain Pish's decision to do this was very brave because he had turned the plane around to face the opposite direction of the runway. Passengers in the back still believed that the plane was going to crash into the water. About 20 minutes later, when the plane had completed a full turn and was heading back towards the airport, Captain aligned it with the runway. Although the plane's altitude was still a bit high, it was not so high that it needed to make another turn. In this way, Captain maneuvered the plane in an S shape towards the runway to increase the distance between the plane and the runway a little. On the ground, the airport's fire brigade, ambulance, and rescue teams were already prepared and stationed, ready to take immediate action in case of any emergency. Due to the lack of flaps, the captain and the first officer could only reduce the plane's speed to 200 knots, while it's typically around 145 knots. Without much control, the captain had just one chance to land the plane on the runway. Eventually, the plane's tires hit the runway with a significant jolt, causing the plane to bounce and then touch down on the runway again. And out of these 12 tires, 8 of them burst. The plane's speed was very high, and it wasn't easy to slow down without wing spoilers and engine reverse thrust. As soon as the captain applied the brakes, the plane's tires completely locked up. The plane started skidding on the runway at a very high speed, because its anti-skid system was also malfunctioning. The plane's tires get completely damaged when they skid on the runway. But somehow, the plane finally stops before the runway ends. Surprisingly, all the passengers and crew members on the plane managed to survive the accident. Upon landing, as per the captain's orders, everyone was immediately evacuated from the plane. Although a fire broke out in one of the left side landing gear wheels of the plane, the fire brigade on the runway was able to quickly extinguish it. Surviving such a close brush with death is something that passengers and crew members cannot easily believe. Initially, both the pilots and the entire crew receive a tremendous welcome, and people look at them as heroes. This is because it was the longest glide achieved by any passenger aircraft in aviation history. Most importantly, no lives were lost in this accident. But a few days later, questions began to arise about how this plane, flying over the Atlantic Ocean, suddenly ran out of fuel. Upon investigation, it became apparent that if the pilots had followed any fuel leak procedure while heading towards Lodges Airport, there would have been at least 3.8 metric tons of fuel left in their plane even after landing at the airport. However, as we mentioned earlier, due to the psychological phenomenon and confirmation bias, the pilots simply didn't understand these fuel leak warnings. Now, as for the actual reason behind the fuel leak, it was a technician's mistake. Actually, sometime before this flight, maintenance work was carried out on the plane's engine number 2. During this process, a technician mistakenly installed a part in the engine that was meant for a different aircraft. This error caused the fuel tube to rupture, leading to the entire incident. While the pilots made a significant mistake by not recognizing the fuel leak warnings, they still deserve praise for the way they handled the situation. To the extent that a year after this incident, both pilots, Captain Robert Pish and First Officer Dirk de Jager, were awarded the Airmanship Award by the Airline Pilot Association. Taking lessons from this incident, Airbus made several significant safety improvements to its planes. Fuel leak indicators were also enhanced. This incident occurred 22 years ago, but the record for the longest glide by a passenger aircraft still belongs to Captain Robert Pish and First Officer Dirk de Jager. So, this was the story of Air Transat Flight 236, which is still considered one of the most popular incidents in aviation history. How did you like this story? Please let us know by commenting. Thanks for watching.